The sound of cicadas filled the scorching August air as Eleanor Washington parked her city-issued sedan across from the pristine white gates of Magnolia Estates. She sat for a moment, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel as beads of sweat traced familiar paths down her temples. Through the ornate iron bars, she could see children splashing in the azure waters of the community pool, their laughter carrying across the manicured lawn. Parents lounged in cushioned chairs, sipping cold drinks in the shade of striped umbrellas. The scene was picture-perfect, except for the barely perceptible shift in posture as her car came to a stop outside their sanctuary. Eleanor knew that look. 55 years of living in this southern town had taught her to recognize the subtle stiffening of shoulders, the quick exchange of glances that signaled someone who looked like her was approaching a space they weren't expected to occupy. She adjusted the collar of her navy blouse, feeling the dampness where it clung to her skin. The thermometer on her dashboard read 97 degrees, but the real temperature was in the triple digits when you counted the humidity. Taking a deep breath, she gathered her clipboard, ID badge, and inspection equipment. In the rearview mirror, she caught a glimpse of herself. Silver threads now outnumbering the black in her tightly coiled hair, fine lines framing eyes that had seen enough to fill several lifetimes. Those eyes now reflected a steely determination that had carried her through 30 years of public service. As she approached the keypad at the entrance, a voice called out behind her. "Excuse me. The pool area is for residents only." Eleanor turned to face a man in his early 60s, his silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the heat. He wore a polo shirt with the community logo embroidered on the chest, khaki shorts, and an expression of practiced authority. "Good afternoon," Eleanor said, her voice calm and measured. I'm Richard Whitmore, president of the Homeowners Association," he interrupted, his eyes not meeting hers but instead focusing on the clipboard in her hands. "And as I said, this is a private community pool. Visitors need to be accompanied by residents." Eleanor felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the momentary constriction that came with these encounters. She'd prepared for this, as she did for every inspection. In one smooth motion, she reached into her pocket and produced her city identification. "I'm Eleanor Washington, Senior Inspector with the Department of Public Health and Safety. I'm here for the scheduled pool inspection." Richard's eyes flickered to the ID, then back to her face. The silence stretched between them, thick as the humidity. "Scheduled? I don't recall any notification about an inspection today," he said, his tone shifting from dismissive to defensive. "The notice was sent 3 weeks ago," Eleanor replied, her voice still even. "Annual inspections are required by law, Mr. Whitmore. I have the confirmation receipt in my files." Behind Richard, several poolgoers had paused their activities, watching the exchange with undisguised interest. Children sensed the tension and quieted their splashing. After what seemed like an eternity, Richard stepped aside, his jaw tight. "Fine. But I'll be accompanying you. We run a tight ship here at Magnolia Estates. You won't find any violations." As the gate buzzed open, Eleanor felt dozens of eyes following her entrance. The chlorine smell hit her immediately, mingling with the coconut scent of sunscreen and the sweet aroma of lemonade from a nearby pitcher. Her sensible shoes made soft squeaking sounds against the wet concrete as she moved toward the pump house, each step deliberate and professional. This was just the beginning of what would become 2 weeks that would change not just Eleanor's life, but the fabric of the entire community. What no one at Magnolia Estates realized that sweltering August afternoon was that Eleanor Washington had spent a lifetime preparing for moments exactly like this one. Moments where dignity and justice hung in a delicate balance. If you're watching this story of quiet courage in the face of prejudice, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like Eleanor's that remind us of the power of dignity. As Eleanor began her inspection, the events of the morning replayed in her mind. Her supervisor, Frank, had called her into his office just before she left. "Eleanor, I'm giving you Magnolia Estates," he'd said, not looking up from his computer. "Magnolia? That's Tom's territory," she'd replied, surprise evident in her voice. Frank had finally looked at her then, his expression unreadable. "Tom's out sick. Besides, I think you're the right person for this one." Eleanor had understood immediately. Frank was one of the good ones. He'd seen how the wealthier communities often responded to inspectors who looked like Eleanor. Rather than shield her from it, he trusted her to handle it with the grace and professionalism that had become her trademark. Now, as she calibrated her testing equipment by the edge of the shimmering pool, she could feel Richard hovering nearby, watching her every move. The water lapped gently against the tiled sides, creating a rhythmic soundtrack to her methodical work. "So how long have you been doing this?" Richard asked, his tone suggesting he was expecting a number small enough to dismiss her expertise. 30 years next month," Eleanor replied without looking up from her instruments. "Started as an administrative assistant and worked my way up. Been a senior inspector for almost 18 years now." She saw the slight shift in his posture from the corner of her eye, the brief, reluctant acknowledgement that she wasn't what he had expected. As Eleanor moved around the pool area, she noticed a young Latino father watching her work with interest, quieting his children's questions. She recognized the look in his eyes, a mixture of curiosity and something like hope. When their gazes met briefly, he nodded in subtle solidarity. The inspection continued methodically. Eleanor tested water quality, checked filtration systems, examined safety equipment, and verified regulatory compliance. Her experienced eye caught details that others might miss: a slightly loose ladder rung, an emergency phone that wasn't properly labeled, inconsistent chlorine levels in certain areas of the pool. "Your maintenance records indicate daily chemical checks, but these readings suggest otherwise," she noted, making an entry on her clipboard. Richard's face tightened. "Thomas is very thorough. Perhaps your equipment is miscalibrated." Eleanor didn't respond to the insinuation. Instead, she simply reached into her bag and produced a second testing kit. "Standard procedure is to verify with a backup when readings are abnormal," she said, repeating the test with the same result. As the afternoon wore on, residents began to drift away from the pool area, but not before casting curious glances at the inspection taking place. Eleanor could hear hushed conversations, could feel judgments being made. Her back ached from bending over equipment, and her blouse was soaked with perspiration, but her movements remained precise, her documentation meticulous. By the time she had finished the physical inspection, the sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the concrete. Only a handful of residents remained, including the young father she had noticed earlier. "Mr. Whitmore, I'll need to see the maintenance office and review the logs," Eleanor said, gathering her equipment. Richard checked his watch with deliberate emphasis. "It's nearly closing time. Can't this wait until tomorrow?" "The inspection must be completed in one visit unless there are extenuating circumstances," Eleanor replied, quoting the regulation verbatim. "The maintenance office, please." As they walked toward a small building at the edge of the property, Eleanor felt a familiar weight settling onto her shoulders. It was the weight of constantly having to assert her authority, of having to be twice as prepared, twice as professional, twice as unflappable as her colleagues. It was exhausting in ways that those who had never experienced it could never understand. Inside the cramped maintenance office, with its sharp smell of cleaning chemicals and the soft hum of a struggling air conditioner, Eleanor began reviewing the logs. The discrepancies became immediately apparent. "These chemical test results don't match what I'm seeing in the pool," she said, flipping through pages of suspiciously identical entries. "And there's no record of the required quarterly equipment inspection from last month." Richard's phone rang, and he stepped outside to take the call, leaving Eleanor alone with the damning evidence of neglect. As she photographed relevant pages for her report, she thought about the children she'd seen playing in the pool. Children potentially at risk because someone had decided that proper maintenance was less important than cutting corners. When Richard returned, his demeanor had changed. There was a calculated smoothness to his voice that immediately put Eleanor on alert. "Ms. Washington, I've just spoken with Thomas Gregory, our maintenance supervisor. He assures me that all required inspections have been completed. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. Why don't we finish this tomorrow? I can have Thomas here to answer any questions." Eleanor closed the logbook with a soft but deliberate thud. "Mr. Whitmore, what I've seen today warrants immediate attention. I'll be leaving you with a preliminary report citing several violations that need to be addressed within 48 hours. The full report will follow, and a re-inspection will be scheduled." Richard's facade cracked slightly. "Violations? That's impossible. We've never had violations before." "Then you've been fortunate," Eleanor replied, her tone professional but firm. "But today's inspection indicates several areas of non-compliance that pose potential safety risks. I'll need your signature acknowledging receipt of the preliminary findings." As she handed him the clipboard, Their eyes met directly for the first time. In his gaze, Eleanor saw what she had seen countless times before, the reluctant realization that his assumptions about her had been wrong, coupled with the unwillingness to fully acknowledge that fact. When Eleanor finally left Magnolia Estates that evening, the sky had turned a deep purple, streaked with orange and gold. The weight of the day hung heavy on her shoulders as she slid behind the wheel of her car. For a moment, she simply sat there, hands resting in her lap, allowing herself to feel the full impact of what had transpired. A tap on her window startled her. Looking up, she saw the young Latino father from the pool, concern evident on his face. She lowered the window. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said quietly. "I've been worried about the pool maintenance for months, but nobody would listen. I'm Jason Reyes, by the way." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. Eleanor Washington. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Reyes." "No, you're doing more than that," he replied, glancing back at the gates of Magnolia Estates. "You're making sure our kids are safe, even when it's not easy to do." He hesitated, then added, "Will you be coming back?" "Yes," Eleanor said, her resolve strengthening. "There will be follow-up inspections until all violations are addressed." Jason nodded, a small smile forming. "Good. I'll see you then." As Eleanor drove away, the encounter with Jason lingered in her mind. It was a reminder of why she did this work, why she endured the subtle and not-so-subtle indignities. Because sometimes, making sure a swimming pool was safe meant standing up to the Richard Whitmores of the world, and that made all the difference. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to maintain your dignity while facing unfair treatment? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story might give someone else the courage they need. The next morning dawned with the promise of another sweltering day. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee as golden sunlight streamed through the curtains, illuminating dancing dust motes in the air. The familiar scent of brewing coffee and the lingering aroma of the toast she'd made earlier provided a comforting start to what she knew would be a challenging day. Her modest home, with its well-worn furniture and walls covered in family photos, had been her sanctuary for over 30 years. It was where she'd raised her 3 children after losing her husband to cancer when the kids were still young. Every corner held memories, the height markings on the doorframe, the slightly crooked shelf her youngest had installed as a teenager, the quilt her grandmother had made draped over her favorite reading chair. As Eleanor reviewed her notes from yesterday's inspection, her phone buzzed with a text message from her daughter Amelia. "Good luck today, Mom. Remember what Grandma always said, they can only make you feel small if you let them." Eleanor smiled, her finger tracing the screen gently. Amelia always seemed to know when her mother needed those reminders. At 32, she had inherited Eleanor's keen perception and quiet strength, along with her father's irrepressible optimism. The Magnolia Estates report lay open on the table, filled with Eleanor's meticulous documentation. The violations were significant enough to warrant immediate attention. Inconsistent chlorine levels, broken safety equipment, falsified maintenance logs, and an electrical issue that posed a serious hazard. Yet experience had taught Eleanor that communities like Magnolia Estates rarely accepted such findings without resistance. She thought back to her early days as an inspector, when she'd been shocked by how differently she was treated compared to her white male colleagues. Where they were respected as authorities, she was questioned, second-guessed, even ignored. The memory of her first major confrontation surfaced, a restaurant owner who had demanded to speak to the real inspector and refused to believe she had the authority to cite his establishment for health code violations. That day had been a turning point. Her supervisor had stood behind her, but more importantly, Eleanor had stood her ground. "I am the real inspector," she had said, her voice firm but not raised. "And these violations are real too. You can address them, or we can close your doors today. The choice is yours." The restaurant owner had complied, but the interaction had left Eleanor shaken. That evening, she had called her mother, tears streaming down her face as she recounted the humiliation. "Baby, listen to me," her mother had said, her voice carrying the wisdom of a woman who had marched for civil rights and integrated her workplace. "Every time you walk through a door that they try to close on you, you're opening it wider for the next person. That's not just a job you're doing, that's legacy work." Legacy work. The phrase had stayed with Eleanor through the decades, becoming her personal mantra on difficult days. And today would be one of those days. As she gathered her things to leave, Eleanor paused by the photo of her mother on the wall, a dignified woman in her Sunday best, chin lifted with quiet pride. "Legacy work," Eleanor whispered to the image. "I'm still at it, Mama." The drive to Magnolia Estates was shorter than Eleanor would have liked. As she approached the community gates, she noticed an unusual amount of activity for a Tuesday morning. Several residents were gathered near the pool area, and a maintenance truck was parked haphazardly by the clubhouse. Eleanor was not surprised to find Richard Whitmore waiting for her at the entrance, his posture rigid with barely contained indignation. Next to him stood a stocky man in work clothes, whom Eleanor presumed was Thomas Gregory, the maintenance supervisor. "Ms. Washington," Richard began as soon as she stepped out of her car, "I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding. Thomas has prepared documentation that contradicts your findings from yesterday." Eleanor nodded politely. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. I'd be happy to review any documentation Mr. Gregory has prepared." Thomas stepped forward, extending a folder. "Ma'am, I've been maintaining pools for 20 years. I think you'll find everything here is in order." Eleanor accepted the folder but didn't open it immediately. "I appreciate your experience, Mr. Gregory. I've been inspecting facilities for 18 years myself. Shall we go inside to discuss this properly?" As they entered the clubhouse, Eleanor was aware of the residents watching from a distance. Among them, she recognized Jason Reyes and, to her mild surprise, an elderly woman who was studying the proceedings with keen interest. The clubhouse interior offered blessed relief from the heat. The space was elegantly appointed with leather furniture, dark wood accents, and framed photographs of the community throughout its 20-year history. Eleanor noticed that the faces in these photos were uniformly white, a detail that spoke volumes about Magnolia Estates' history. They settled at a conference table, where Eleanor finally opened the folder Thomas had provided. Inside were maintenance logs that differed significantly from what she had seen the previous day, along with equipment certification documents that appeared newly printed. "Mr. Gregory," Eleanor said carefully, "these logs are not the same ones I reviewed yesterday." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. I realized I'd shown you the wrong set. These are the actual records." "I see," Eleanor replied, her tone neutral as she placed her own copies of yesterday's logs on the table. "And yet these photos I took of the original logs tell a different story, as do my water quality test results." Richard's face flushed. "Are you suggesting Thomas falsified records?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Whitmore. I'm stating facts based on evidence collected during an official inspection." Eleanor's voice remained calm, but her eyes held a firmness that made Richard look away first. "Now, we can continue to debate these findings, or we can address the violations so that your pool can remain open safely for the residents." "Open?" Richard's head snapped up. "Are you threatening to close our pool in the middle of August?" "I'm informing you of the potential consequences if the safety violations aren't addressed," Eleanor clarified. "Particularly the electrical issue near the pump house. That alone constitutes grounds for immediate closure until repaired." The tension in the room was palpable. Thomas stared at his hands, while Richard seemed to be calculating his options. Before he could respond, the door to the conference room opened, and the elderly woman Eleanor had noticed outside entered, followed by Jason Reyes. "Richard, what's going on here?" the woman asked, her voice carrying the gentle lilt of old Southern money, but with a sharpness that suggested she wasn't to be trifled with. Richard stood immediately. "Martha, this doesn't concern the social committee. When it involves the safety of our grandchildren, it concerns all of us," Martha replied, turning to Eleanor with an outstretched hand. "I'm Martha Johnson. I've lived in Magnolia Estates since it was built. And you must be the inspector I've heard about from Jason here." Eleanor stood and shook Martha's hand, noting the surprising strength in the older woman's grip. "Eleanor Washington, ma'am. Department of Public Health and Safety." Martha's eyes, bright blue and alert despite her 78 years, assessed Eleanor thoughtfully. "Well, Ms. Washington, why don't you tell us exactly what's wrong with our pool? In plain English, if you don't mind." For the next 20 minutes, Eleanor explained the violations in clear, non-technical terms. She described how faulty electrical wiring near water created shock hazards, how improper chemical balance could lead to respiratory issues or skin reactions, and how broken safety equipment could mean the difference between life and death in an emergency. As she spoke, Martha nodded gravely, while Jason occasionally interjected with questions. Richard remained silent, his earlier bluster deflated by Martha's presence. Thomas looked increasingly uncomfortable. "And you're saying these issues have been ongoing?" Martha asked when Eleanor had finished. "Based on the original logs I reviewed, yes. For at least 3 months, possibly longer." Martha turned to Richard, her expression stern. "Richard, I helped write the bylaws for this community. Safety has always been our first priority, above aesthetics, above convenience, certainly above pride. If Ms. Washington says there are violations that need addressing, then they will be addressed. Immediately." Richard's jaw worked silently for a moment before he responded. "Martha, with all due respect, the board makes these decisions, not the social committee." "Then call an emergency board meeting," Martha replied smoothly. "I'm sure Sarah Chen would be interested to hear about potential liability issues, given her legal background. And Michael Davis has grandchildren who swim here daily." The mention of these names seemed to deflate Richard further. Eleanor watched the exchange with interest, recognizing the power dynamics at play. Martha Johnson might not hold an official title, but her influence was undeniable. "Fine," Richard finally conceded. "Thomas, get a crew on the electrical issue today. Ms. Washington, how soon can you return for a reinspection?" "I'll schedule it for Friday," Eleanor replied. "That should give you time to address the most critical issues. A full remediation plan for the remaining violations will need to be submitted by then as well." As the meeting concluded, Eleanor felt a small sense of victory. It wasn't complete. Richard's reluctant compliance was far from an acknowledgement of her authority, but it was a step in the right direction. Outside, as Eleanor was returning to her car, Martha fell into step beside her. "You handled that very well," the older woman said, her pace unhurried despite the heat. "Richard can be challenging when his authority is questioned." "Thank you, Ms. Johnson," Eleanor replied. "I appreciate your support in there." Martha waved a dismissive hand. "Martha, please. And I didn't do it for you, though I admire your professionalism. I did it because it was right." She paused, studying Eleanor for a moment. "You know, you remind me of someone I met during the sit-ins in '63. Same quiet strength, same unwavering dignity. She taught me that sometimes the loudest statement is simply refusing to be moved." Eleanor felt a rush of unexpected emotion at the comparison. "My mother was at those sit-ins," she said softly. "Mabel Washington." Martha's eyes widened. "Mabel's daughter? Well, that explains a lot." She shook her head with a small laugh. "Your mother once stared down a police officer for a full 5 minutes without saying a word. Just her presence was enough to make him reconsider what he was about to do." Her expression grew serious again. "Listen, Eleanor, you're going to face resistance here. Not everyone in Magnolia Estates is ready to examine their assumptions, if you understand me." "I understand completely," Eleanor replied. "Good. Then also understand you're not alone. Some of us have been waiting a long time for things to change around here." Martha reached into her purse and pulled out a small card. "My number. Call me if you need anything." As Martha walked away, her back straight despite her years, Eleanor felt something she hadn't expected to find at Magnolia Estates, an ally. And perhaps, something even more valuable, a connection to her mother's legacy that felt almost mystical in its timing. The encounter left Eleanor with renewed determination. As she drove away from Magnolia Estates, she realized that what had begun as a routine inspection was becoming something much more significant, a test of whether systems designed to protect some could be made to work for all. If this story of strength and dignity in the face of prejudice resonates with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support means we can continue bringing stories like Eleanor's to light. That evening, as Eleanor sat on her back porch watching fireflies rise from her garden like sparks from a hidden fire, her phone rang. The caller ID showed her supervisor's name. "Frank." "Everything all right?" she answered, setting aside her glass of iced tea. "Just checking in, Eleanor. How did it go at Magnolia Estates today?" Frank's voice carried concern that went beyond professional interest. Eleanor sighed, leaning back in her chair as a chorus of crickets provided background music to their conversation. "About as expected. Resistance, denial, attempt to cover up the violations. But there might be some progress. They've agreed to fix the most critical issues before Friday's re-inspection. Good. A pause. Look, I got a call from someone named Richard Whitmore this afternoon. He was, let's say, inquiring about your qualifications and whether someone else might be available to conduct the re-inspection. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, feeling a familiar stab of frustration. And what did you tell him? That you're the most qualified inspector we have, and that if he has concerns about your findings, he's welcome to appeal through official channels. Frank's voice hardened slightly. Eleanor, you know I've got your back on this, right? If these people think they can intimidate us into looking the other way, I know, Frank. And I appreciate it. Eleanor opened her eyes to watch a particularly bold firefly hovering just beyond the porch rail. But this isn't anything new. We both knew what might happen when you assigned me to Magnolia Estates. Doesn't make it right, Frank muttered. No, it doesn't, Eleanor agreed. But it makes it important that we stand our ground. After hanging up, Eleanor remained on the porch, listening to the night sounds and thinking about Richard's attempt to go over her head. It was a familiar tactic, one she had encountered throughout her career. The assumption that a black woman couldn't possibly be the final authority, that there must be someone else, someone who looked more like Richard, who could overrule her. The thought brought back memories of her early years in the department, when she was still finding her voice. She had been the only woman of color in the inspector division then, navigating a landscape where every mistake was magnified and every success was treated as an exception. She remembered one particular incident, about 15 years ago, that had nearly broken her resolve. She had cited a prominent hotel for serious health code violations, only to have the owner call her supervisor, the department head, and eventually the mayor's office, claiming she was targeting his business. For days, Eleanor had endured questioning from her superiors, had presented her evidence again and again, had defended her professional judgment while the hotel continued operating with violations that put guests at risk. It was her daughter Amelia, then a high school senior, who had ultimately steadied her. "Mom," she'd said, finding Eleanor at the kitchen table late one night, surrounded by inspection reports and documentation, "remember when you caught me trying to cover up that D in algebra? You told me that integrity means doing what's right even when it's hard, even when everyone's against you. You said the truth doesn't stop being true just because people don't want to hear it." Eleanor had looked up at her daughter, seeing wisdom beyond her years, and had felt a surge of both pride and determination. The next day, she had walked into a meeting with the hotel owner and department officials with her head high and her evidence meticulously organized. By the end of that meeting, the violations were acknowledged, and Eleanor's reputation for uncompromising integrity was cemented. Now, years later, facing Richard Whitmore's similar tactics, Eleanor found strength in that memory. This wasn't just about a swimming pool inspection anymore. It was about whether power and privilege could override truth and safety. And Eleanor Washington had spent a lifetime refusing to let that happen. With renewed resolve, she pulled out her inspection notes and began preparing for Friday's confrontation, knowing it would take all her professional skill and personal courage to see this through. The next 2 days passed in a blur of other inspections and paperwork, but Eleanor's thoughts frequently returned to Magnolia Estates. She wondered if the electrical issues were being properly addressed, if Martha Johnson was continuing to advocate for safety, if Richard Whitmore was plotting further resistance. On Thursday evening, she received an unexpected call from Jason Reyes. "Ms. Washington, it's Jason, from Magnolia Estates. I hope it's okay that Martha gave me your number." "Of course," Eleanor replied, curious about the reason for his call. "Is everything all right?" There was a slight hesitation before Jason continued. "I wanted to let you know there's been a lot of discussion in the community since your visit. Richard called a residents' meeting this afternoon. He framed the pool issues as a misunderstanding and implied that you might have a personal agenda." Eleanor felt a familiar weight settling in her stomach. "I see." "No, I don't think you do," Jason said, his voice gaining urgency. Because what he didn't expect was for people to question him. Sarah Chen, she's on the board, really sharp, used to be a corporate lawyer. She asked to see the actual inspection report. And Michael Davis, he's a retired school principal. He wanted to know why the maintenance logs were suddenly different from what they'd been seeing at previous board meetings. Hope flickered in Eleanor's chest. "And how did Richard respond?" "Not well," Jason admitted with a slight chuckle. "But that's not why I called. I called because there's a group of us who want to make sure tomorrow's reinspection goes smoothly. We'll be there, just so you know you're not walking into the lion's den alone." The gesture touched Eleanor deeply. "Thank you, Jason. That means more than you know." After they hung up, Eleanor sat with a feeling of unexpected support. Throughout her career, she had grown accustomed to fighting these battles alone, to being the only one willing to stand up against the Richard Whitmores of the world. The thought that residents of Magnolia Estates might be allies in this struggle was both surprising and profoundly moving. That night, Eleanor dreamed of her mother, not as the elderly woman she had been when she passed, but as the young activist in the black and white photographs, sitting proudly at a segregated lunch counter, her dignity a shield against hatred. In the dream, her mother turned to her and smiled, a smile that contained both recognition and a passing of the torch. Eleanor woke with tears on her cheeks but strength in her heart. Today's reinspection would be a test, not just of Magnolia Estates' compliance with safety regulations, but of whether the community was ready to confront the more subtle violations that had nothing to do with pool maintenance and everything to do with human dignity. As she dressed in her most professional outfit, a crisp white blouse, navy slacks, and a light blazer despite the heat, Eleanor thought about the layers of preparation this day required. She needed her technical expertise to evaluate whether the violations had been addressed. She needed her emotional fortitude to withstand whatever resistance she might face. And she needed her mother's quiet strength to remember why this mattered beyond one swimming pool in one affluent community. The drive to Magnolia Estates felt different this time. Eleanor's car radio played an old gospel song her mother had loved, its familiar melody bringing comfort as she approached the ornate gates that had come to represent so much more than a boundary between public and private property. As she turned into the community entrance, Eleanor was surprised to see a small group waiting near the clubhouse. She recognized Jason, Martha, and several others she assumed were Sarah Chen and Michael Davis based on Jason's descriptions. Richard Whitmore stood apart from them, his expression unreadable, with Thomas Gregory hovering nervously at his side. Eleanor parked her car and took a deep breath before stepping out into the August heat that shimmered above the asphalt. Despite the early hour, the temperature was already climbing toward uncomfortable levels. She gathered her equipment and approached the waiting group, her stride purposeful and her expression professionally neutral. "Good morning," she said, addressing everyone equally. "I'm here for the scheduled reinspection." Martha stepped forward, extending her hand. "Good morning, Eleanor. We thought we'd welcome you properly today." Richard cleared his throat. "Ms. Washington, before we begin, I want to clarify that we've addressed the electrical issue you identified. Thomas has the documentation for the repairs." "Excellent," Eleanor replied. "I'll need to inspect the repairs myself, of course, but it's good to hear they've been completed." A woman stepped forward, Asian American, perhaps in her mid-40s, with an air of quiet authority. "Ms. Washington, I'm Sarah Chen. I serve on the board here at Magnolia, and I'd like to accompany you on today's inspection, if that's acceptable." Eleanor nodded. "Of course, Ms. Chen. Anyone else who wishes to observe is welcome to do so." Richard's face tightened slightly, but he maintained his composure. "In that case, I'll be joining as well." The next 2 hours were a study in contrasts. Where Richard watched Eleanor's inspection with thinly veiled skepticism, Sarah asked thoughtful questions about safety regulations and compliance requirements. Where Thomas nervously presented documentation of the electrical repairs, Michael Davis, the dignified African-American man Jason had mentioned, examined the work with a critical eye, asking pointed questions about why the issue hadn't been identified in regular maintenance. As the inspection progressed, Eleanor confirmed that the most critical safety violations had indeed been addressed. The electrical wiring had been properly repaired and certified by a licensed electrician. The broken safety equipment had been replaced. The chemical balance in the pool had been corrected, though Eleanor noted it would need regular monitoring to ensure continued compliance. "The immediate safety concerns have been addressed," Eleanor announced as they gathered in the clubhouse to review her findings. "However, there are still issues with the maintenance documentation and procedures that need to be resolved for full compliance." Richard leaned forward, his expression challenging. "But the pool can remain open." "Yes, provided the maintenance plan I'm requiring is implemented immediately and documented properly," Eleanor replied. "I'll need to see daily chemical testing logs, equipment inspection schedules, and staff training records." And I'll be scheduling a follow-up inspection in 2 weeks to ensure continued compliance. 2 weeks. Richard's voice rose slightly. Is that really necessary? Sarah Chen interjected before Eleanor could respond. Given what we've learned about the previous maintenance practices, I think a follow-up inspection is entirely appropriate. In fact, as a board member, I'd like to request that Ms. Washington provide us with a comprehensive safety training session for our maintenance staff and resident volunteers. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, surprised but pleased by the suggestion. That could certainly be arranged, Ms. Chen. My department offers community training sessions as part of our public outreach. The meeting continued with discussion of specific requirements and timelines. Throughout it all, Eleanor maintained her professional demeanor, presenting facts without accusation, outlining requirements without apology. She noticed how the dynamic had shifted from her previous visits, how Richard's authority seemed diminished in the presence of residents asking questions and demanding transparency. As the meeting concluded and people began to disperse, Martha approached Eleanor with a warm smile. We're having a little gathering at my house on Sunday afternoon. Nothing fancy, just some iced tea and conversation. I'd be honored if you'd join us. Eleanor hesitated, aware of the unusual nature of the invitation. In 18 years of inspections, she had never socialized with residents of a facility she oversaw. Martha seemed to read her thoughts. This isn't about the inspection, Eleanor. This is about community, about connections that should have been made long ago. After a moment's consideration, Eleanor nodded. I'd like that, Martha. Thank you. As Eleanor gathered her things to leave, she found Richard waiting by the door, his expression difficult to read. Ms. Washington, he began, his tone formally polite. I want to assure you that Magnolia Estates takes safety very seriously. The issues you identified, they shouldn't have happened. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was an acknowledgement, perhaps all that Richard Whitmore was capable of at this point. I believe you want what's best for your community, Mr. Whitmore, Eleanor replied. And safe facilities are certainly part of that. For a moment, something like understanding passed between them, a recognition that beneath their differences lay a shared concern for the well-being of others, albeit expressed in vastly different ways. As Eleanor walked to her car, she felt lighter than she had in days. Not because the battle was won. She knew better than to assume one inspection could overcome years of entrenched attitudes, but because she had glimpsed the possibility of change. In the questions Sarah Chen had asked, in Martha Johnson's unflinching support, in Michael Davis's quiet dignity, and even in Richard Whitmore's grudging acknowledgement, Eleanor saw the first stirrings of a community beginning to examine itself. Driving away from Magnolia Estates, Eleanor thought about Sunday's gathering and what it might represent. Perhaps this inspection, initially met with resistance and dismissal, would be remembered as the beginning of something important, not just for Eleanor Washington, but for a community learning, however slowly, to see beyond its gates. Have you ever seen a community come together to make positive changes after a challenging situation? What sparked that transformation? Share your experiences in the comments below. Sunday arrived with a gentle breeze that offered slight relief from the relentless August heat. Eleanor stood on Martha Johnson's porch, a homemade peach cobbler in her hands and uncertainty in her heart. The colonial-style house, with its white columns and wraparound porch, represented a world to which Eleanor had never truly been invited. Not as an equal, not as a guest, not as herself. She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of Martha's carefully tended roses that climbed a trellis beside the steps. Their fragrance mixed with the distant smell of someone grilling and the sweet perfume of blooming magnolias that gave the community its name. Before she could ring the bell, the door swung open, revealing Martha's welcoming smile. Eleanor! Right on time. Come in, come in. Martha ushered her inside, taking the cobbler with appreciative noises. Oh, this looks wonderful. You shouldn't have gone to the trouble, but I'm so glad you did. The interior of Martha's home was elegant but comfortable, filled with antiques that spoke of family history and walls adorned with photographs spanning generations. Eleanor was surprised to see several civil rights-era photos prominently displayed, including one of a much younger Martha marching alongside both black and white protesters. That was Birmingham, 63, Martha said, noticing Eleanor's attention to the photograph. I was 22 and terrified. My parents threatened to disown me. But some things are worth risking everything for. The comment hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that transcended the historical reference. Before Eleanor could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of other guests. Sarah Chen entered, followed by Michael Davis and his wife Patricia, then Jason Reyes and his family. Several other residents whom Eleanor recognized from her inspections but hadn't formally met joined the gathering. Conspicuously absent was Richard Whitmore. The afternoon unfolded in a way Eleanor couldn't have anticipated. What began as somewhat stiff politeness gradually warmed into genuine conversation. Over Martha's famous sweet tea and a spread of potluck dishes, Eleanor found herself drawn into discussions about community issues, local politics, and personal histories. Sarah Chen, sharp and articulate, shared how she'd faced discrimination in her corporate law career. The assumptions were always there, that I got the job because of diversity initiatives, that I wouldn't be assertive enough, that I somehow wasn't American enough despite being born in Chicago. Her laugh held both humor and old pain. I spent years working twice as hard to get half the recognition, until one day I realized that no amount of perfection would change some people's perceptions. Michael Davis nodded in recognition. When I became principal at Jefferson High, there were parents who pulled their children out. Didn't matter that I had 20 years of teaching experience and a doctorate in education. They just saw my skin color and decided I couldn't possibly be qualified to lead. These stories, shared without bitterness but with honest recognition of the wounds they had left, created a space for vulnerability that Eleanor hadn't expected to find at Magnolia Estates. As the afternoon progressed, the conversation turned to the community itself, its history, its present challenges, and its possible future. Magnolia was founded with certain expectations, Martha explained, her voice carrying the weight of uncomfortable truth. Not explicit restrictions, not in writing, that would have been illegal. But there were understandings about who belonged here. Which is why we have exactly 3 black families, 2 Latino families, and 4 Asian families in a community of 87 homes, Michael added dryly. And why your inspection caused such a stir, Sarah said, turning to Eleanor. It wasn't just about the pool violations. It was about who had the authority to tell Magnolia Estates it was doing something wrong. Eleanor sipped her tea, considering how to respond. Throughout her career, she had learned to navigate these conversations carefully, to speak truth without alienating those who might not be ready to hear it. Authority is a funny thing, she finally said. In my position, it's given to me by my credentials, my experience, and the regulations I enforce. But we all know that official authority isn't always recognized, depending on who's holding it. She set down her glass, meeting the eyes of those around her. What I've learned is that real authority comes from something deeper than titles or positions. It comes from integrity, from consistency, from the courage to stand for what's right even when it's difficult. A thoughtful silence followed her words. Then Jason, who had been quiet for much of the gathering, spoke up. My kids were at the pool the day you first came, Ms. Washington. On the way home, my son asked me why some people were being mean to the lady who was just doing her job. He shook his head, a mix of sadness and determination in his expression. I want them to grow up in a community where that question doesn't need to be asked. Where doing the right thing isn't complicated by who you are or what you look like. That's why we're here today, Martha said, looking around at the gathered faces. Because Magnolia Estates can be that community. But not without some honest conversations and probably some uncomfortable changes. As the discussion continued, Eleanor found herself sharing more than she had initially intended. Stories from her years as an inspector, the challenges she had faced, the small victories that had kept her going. In turn, the residents opened up about their own experiences, about the unspoken tensions within Magnolia Estates, about their hopes for its future. When Eleanor finally prepared to leave, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across Martha's carefully manicured lawn. The temperature had cooled slightly, and a chorus of cicadas had begun their evening serenade. Several guests left at the same time, exchanging phone numbers and promises to continue the conversation. Martha walked Eleanor to her car, their steps slow and deliberate in the golden evening light. This was just a beginning, Martha said, her voice quiet but determined. But beginnings matter. Eleanor nodded, feeling the weight of the afternoon's conversations. They do. Though change rarely comes easily. No, Martha agreed with a small smile. But it comes. Sometimes slowly, sometimes in unexpected ways, but it comes. She reached out and squeezed Eleanor's hand. "Thank you for being part of our beginning." As Eleanor drove home through the gathering dusk, she reflected on the unexpected turn her professional duty had taken. What had begun as a routine pool inspection had somehow become a catalyst for change in a community that had long resisted it. And though Eleanor was under no illusions about the difficulties that lay ahead, the resistance that would come, the setbacks that were inevitable, she felt a quiet hope taking root. That night, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor called her daughter Amelia to share the day's events. "So you ended up at a Magnolia Estates tea party," Amelia said with a laugh. "I bet that wasn't in your inspection manual." "Definitely not," Eleanor agreed, smiling at her daughter's teasing. "But it felt important, Amelia. Like something shifting that needed to shift for a long time. You know what Grandma would say, don't you?" Amelia's voice softened with the memory of the grandmother she had adored. Eleanor closed her eyes, picturing her mother's face. That when doors start to open, you walk through them with your head high, even if you're not sure what's waiting on the other side. "Exactly," Amelia said. "I'm proud of you, Mom, for walking through that door." The conversation left Eleanor with a sense of connection, to her daughter, to her mother's memory, and now to a community that was cautiously opening itself to change. As she drifted toward sleep, Eleanor wondered what the coming weeks would bring, knowing only that the path forward would require both courage and compassion from all involved. If you're finding value in this journey of courage and transformation, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to continue bringing you stories of real change happening in communities across America. The following week brought an unexpected development. Eleanor arrived at her office Monday morning to find Frank waiting by her desk, his expression a mixture of concern and irritation. "Richard Whitmore called the department director," he said without preamble. "Apparently, he's filing a formal complaint about your inspection process." Eleanor set down her bag, a familiar tension beginning to build at the base of her skull. "On what grounds?" "The usual smoke and mirrors," Frank replied, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Claiming you were unnecessarily punitive, that you targeted Magnolia Estates, that your findings were exaggerated. Nothing concrete, nothing that would stand up to scrutiny, but enough to create headaches for everyone involved." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised but disappointed nonetheless. "I have full documentation of every violation, Frank. Photos, test results, the original maintenance logs before they tried to replace them. My report is solid." "I know that," Frank assured her. "And Director Collins knows it too. But there will need to be a review, and in the meantime, Collins wants me to assign someone else to the follow-up inspection." "What?" Eleanor felt a flash of indignation. "That's exactly what Whitmore wants, to undermine my authority and get someone he thinks will be more accommodating." Frank's expression was sympathetic but firm. "It's protocol when there's a formal complaint, Eleanor. You know that. The good news is that Collins is assigning Tom Baker to review your findings, and Tom's not the type to be intimidated by someone like Whitmore." Eleanor did know the protocol, and she respected the need for accountability in their department. But the timing felt deliberate, a calculated move by Richard Whitmore to regain control of a situation that had begun to slip away from him. "There's more," Frank continued, his voice lower now. "Whitmore mentioned your social visit to Magnolia Estates yesterday. Suggested it was inappropriate for an inspector to fraternize with residents of a facility under review." The implication stung, transforming what had been a meaningful afternoon of connection into something that could be used against her professionally. Eleanor took a deep breath, fighting back the urge to defend herself immediately. "I was invited to a community gathering by Martha Johnson," she said carefully. "It wasn't related to the inspection, and nothing about the inspection was discussed inappropriately." "I believe you," Frank said. "But it complicates things. Collins wants to see you at 2 o'clock to discuss the situation." As Frank walked away, Eleanor sat at her desk, a heaviness settling over her. She had faced challenges to her professional judgment before, had weathered complaints and accusations throughout her career. But this felt different, more personal, more deliberate, more entangled with the very issues of respect and recognition that had shaped her life's journey. She spent the morning reviewing her Magnolia Estates documentation, ensuring every detail was in order, every violation clearly substantiated. By the time she headed to Director Collins' office, Eleanor was armed with facts, regulations, and the quiet determination that had carried her through 3 decades of public service. Director Collins, a tall woman with prematurely silver hair and a reputation for fairness, gestured Eleanor to a seat across from her desk. "Eleanor," she began, her tone businesslike but not unkind, "I've known you for what, 15 years now? I've never had reason to question your professionalism or your judgment." "Thank you, Director," Eleanor replied, maintaining the formal address that had always characterized their relationship. "That said, we have a situation here that requires careful handling." Collins tapped a folder on her desk. "Richard Whitmore's complaint, presumably. Mr. Whitmore is well-connected. His concerns have already reached the mayor's office." Eleanor felt a familiar tightening in her chest but kept her expression neutral. "I understand the political realities, Director. But the violations at Magnolia Estates were real and well documented. Some posed immediate safety risks to residents, particularly children using the pool facilities." "I've reviewed your report," Collins acknowledged. "The evidence seems clear. But there's also the matter of your social visit to the community yesterday." "It wasn't a social visit in the way Mr. Whitmore has characterized it," Eleanor clarified. "I was invited to a community gathering by a resident who wanted to discuss broader issues affecting Magnolia Estates. Nothing inappropriate was discussed regarding the inspection or my findings." Collins studied her for a moment. "Nevertheless, it creates an appearance of potential bias. And in our position, appearances matter." She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Here's what we're going to do. Tom Baker will review your findings and conduct the follow-up inspection scheduled for next week. You'll be temporarily assigned to other facilities until the review is complete. If your findings are upheld, which I expect they will be, you'll be cleared to resume normal duties, including any future inspections at Magnolia Estates." It was a reasonable approach, following department protocol while still respecting Eleanor's professional standing. Yet Eleanor couldn't help feeling that once again, someone like Richard Whitmore had managed to disrupt the system to serve his own purposes, even if only temporarily. "I understand, Director," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her disappointment. "I'll provide Tom with all my documentation and notes." As she left Collins' office, Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text message from Martha Johnson. "Emergency board meeting called for tonight. Richard on the warpath. We'll keep you posted." The message confirmed what Eleanor had suspected. Richard's complaint wasn't an isolated action but part of a broader strategy to reassert control. She texted back a brief thanks, wondering what was unfolding at Magnolia Estates and how it might affect the residents who had begun to question the status quo. The rest of the day passed in a blur of paperwork and routine inspections, but Eleanor's thoughts kept returning to Magnolia Estates. By the time she arrived home that evening, she felt drained, not just physically but emotionally, in the particular way that comes from fighting battles that never seem to end, only change form. She settled on her porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the neighborhood children playing in the early evening light. The familiar scene usually brought her comfort, but tonight it only reminded her of what was at stake in communities like Magnolia Estates. The right of every child to swim in a safe pool, to live in a community where rules protected everyone equally, to grow up seeing people who looked like them in positions of authority and respect. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Jason Reyes. "Ms. Washington," he began, his voice tense with controlled anger, "I thought you should know what happened at tonight's meeting. Richard tried to have Martha removed from the social committee. Said she was creating division in the community and undermining board authority. Then he announced that he'd filed a complaint against you and that you wouldn't be conducting the follow-up inspection." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. "I'm sorry to hear that, Jason. How did the residents respond?" "That's why I'm calling," Jason said, his tone shifting from anger to something like satisfaction. "It backfired. Completely." Sarah Chen questioned why Richard had filed a complaint without board consultation. Michael Davis pointed out that the safety violations were documented and real, regardless of who identified them. And when Richard suggested that yesterday's gathering at Martha's was somehow inappropriate, half the room stood up to defend both Martha and you. A small flame of hope kindled in Eleanor's chest. "And the outcome?" Richard tried to call for a vote on Martha's committee position, but Sarah pointed out that wasn't within the board's authority according to the bylaws. Then Michael proposed a resolution affirming the community's commitment to addressing the safety violations and thanking the Department of Public Health for bringing them to our attention. Jason's voice contained a smile now. It passed. Unanimously. Even Richard couldn't vote against safety without looking petty. The news wasn't a complete victory. Richard's complaint still stood. Eleanor was still temporarily removed from the Magnolia Estates inspection, but it represented something powerful, a community beginning to hold itself accountable, to question leadership that acted from self-interest rather than the common good. "Thank you for letting me know, Jason," Eleanor said, genuine gratitude in her voice. "It matters to hear this." After they hung up, Eleanor remained on the porch, watching as dusk transformed her neighborhood. Street lights flickered on, parents called children home for dinner, and the day's heat began to give way to a gentler evening warmth. In the distance, thunder rumbled, a summer storm approaching, bringing the promise of rain to break the August humidity. The situation at Magnolia Estates had become something Eleanor hadn't expected. Not just a professional challenge, but a personal journey that connected to her deepest values and her family's legacy. Whatever came next, she would face it with the dignity and determination that had guided her life. And perhaps, just perhaps, what had begun as conflict might yet become transformation. I know many of you watching have experienced moments where what seemed like a setback led to unexpected positive changes. If you've witnessed a community standing up for what's right, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. The next morning brought a torrential downpour that turned the world beyond Eleanor's windows into a blur of gray. The rain drummed against the roof with a ferocity that matched her unsettled emotions, a mixture of professional frustration, personal resolve, and cautious hope based on Jason's report from the previous night's meeting. As she prepared for a day of inspections in facilities that weren't Magnolia Estates, Eleanor's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Eleanor Washington," she answered, her professional tone automatic. "Ms. Washington, this is Sarah Chen from Magnolia Estates." The voice was crisp and direct. "I hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all, Ms. Chen. What can I do for you?" There was a brief pause, the sound of papers shuffling. "I've been reviewing our maintenance records for the past 2 years. The real ones, not the versions Thomas Gregory prepared for your inspection. What I've found is troubling. There's a pattern of neglect that goes well beyond the pool area, and some evidence that funds allocated for maintenance have been misappropriated." Eleanor sat up straighter, her inspector's instincts immediately alert. "That's concerning, Ms. Chen. Have you brought this to the board's attention?" "That's partly why I'm calling," Sarah replied. "After last night's meeting, several of us stayed to discuss next steps. Richard stormed out when his motion against Martha failed, which actually gave us the opportunity to speak more freely. We formed an ad hoc committee to investigate the maintenance issues, and we'd like your professional guidance, not as an inspector, but as a consultant with expertise in facility management and safety compliance." The request caught Eleanor by surprise. It represented both an opportunity and a potential complication. As a private citizen, she was free to offer general advice based on her professional knowledge. But given Richard's complaint and her temporary removal from the Magnolia Estates inspection, any involvement would need to be carefully considered. "I appreciate the trust that represents Ms. Chen," Eleanor said carefully. "But given the current situation with Mr. Whitmore's complaint, I need to be cautious about any involvement that could be perceived as circumventing the formal inspection process." "I understand completely," Sarah assured her. "We're not asking you to conduct unofficial inspections or anything that would compromise your professional position. We're looking for education, helping us understand what to look for, what questions to ask, what documentation to request. All things any concerned resident should know." Put that way, the request seemed reasonable. A community seeking to educate itself about safety standards that affected everyone's well-being. Still, Eleanor proceeded with caution. "I would need to clear any consultation with my department, given the circumstances," she said. "But I'm open to the possibility, assuming it can be done appropriately." "That's all we're asking," Sarah replied, satisfaction evident in her voice. "And I should mention, we've also requested a meeting with Director Collins at your department to discuss our concerns about Mr. Whitmore's complaint. Several of us feel it's an attempt to divert attention from the real issues at Magnolia Estates, and we want to go on record with our support for your inspection findings." The show of support touched Eleanor deeply. Throughout her career, she had often stood alone when her authority was challenged, had fought her battles with determination but little external validation. The thought of Magnolia Estates residents actively advocating on her behalf was as surprising as it was moving. "Thank you, Ms. Chen. That means a great deal. After the call ended, Eleanor sat with the complex emotions it had stirred. There was gratitude for the unexpected alliance, caution about maintaining professional boundaries, and something else, a sense that what was unfolding at Magnolia Estates might represent a kind of healing, not just for a divided community but for the accumulated wounds of countless small indignities Eleanor had weathered throughout her life. The rain continued to fall as Eleanor drove to her first inspection of the day, a routine check of a public swimming pool that had been renovated over the winter. The familiar work brought a measure of steadiness, a reminder that regardless of the situation at Magnolia Estates, Eleanor Washington had a job to do, a responsibility to ensure public safety that transcended any individual conflict. During her lunch break, she received a message from Director Collins asking her to come by the office at the end of the day. The brief text gave no indication of the purpose, leaving Eleanor to wonder whether it was related to Sarah Chen's mentioned meeting request or some new development in Richard's complaint. By the time Eleanor arrived at Collins' office, the rain had ceased, leaving behind a freshly washed world gleaming in late afternoon sunlight. The abrupt change in weather seemed symbolic somehow, a reminder that storms, no matter how fierce, eventually pass. Director Collins gestured Eleanor to a seat, her expression unreadable. "I had an interesting meeting today," she began without preamble. 3 residents from Magnolia Estates, Sarah Chen, Michael Davis, and Martha Johnson, came to discuss Richard Whitmore's complaint against you. Eleanor nodded, waiting for Collins to continue. They presented a rather compelling case that Whitmore's actions are less about your inspection procedures and more about attempting to maintain a status quo that has allowed maintenance issues to go unaddressed. Collins tapped her fingers thoughtfully on her desk. They also expressed concern that the department might be susceptible to political pressure from someone with Whitmore's connections. "And are we?" Eleanor asked quietly. Collins' gaze sharpened. "Not while I'm director." She pushed a folder across the desk. "Tom Baker completed his review of your inspection findings this morning. His conclusion is that not only were your citations valid, but that you may have been overly generous in some areas. The electrical issues were potentially more serious than your initial report indicated." Relief washed over Eleanor, though she had never doubted the validity of her findings. "So the follow-up inspection will proceed as scheduled next week," Collins finished for her. "And you'll be conducting it." The decision represented a complete vindication, a public acknowledgement that Eleanor's professional judgment had been sound all along. Yet even as she felt satisfaction, Eleanor recognized that the larger issues at Magnolia Estates, both the safety violations and the deeper currents of prejudice and privilege, remained unresolved. "Thank you, Director," she said simply. Collins leaned back in her chair, studying Eleanor with a thoughtful expression. "You know, I've been in this department for 25 years. I've seen plenty of complaints filed against inspectors. It comes with the territory. But I've rarely seen community members mobilize so quickly to defend an inspector's findings." A small smile touched her lips. "Whatever you did at Magnolia Estates, beyond identifying legitimate safety issues, seems to have struck a chord." "I didn't do anything special," Eleanor replied honestly. "I just did my job without allowing myself to be intimidated or dismissed." "And sometimes, that's revolutionary," Collins observed. "Doing your job with dignity when others expect you to retreat or apologize for your authority." She closed the folder on her desk with a decisive motion. "The follow-up inspection is scheduled for next Tuesday. I've informed Mr. Whitmore that his complaint has been reviewed and dismissed for lack of substantiation, and that you'll be continuing as the assigned inspector for Magnolia Estates." As Eleanor left the office, the weight that had settled on her shoulders since Monday morning began to lift. The path ahead was still challenging. Richard Whitmore's resistance was unlikely to simply evaporate, and changing ingrained attitudes required more than one community meeting or one vindicated inspection. But something had shifted, both at Magnolia Estates and within Eleanor herself. That evening, as she prepared dinner in her quiet kitchen, Eleanor found herself reflecting on her mother's words from decades ago. "Every time you walk through a door that they try to close on you, you're opening it wider for the next person." Throughout her career, Eleanor had focused on doing her job with integrity and persistence, on proving through consistent excellence that she deserved the authority she held. But perhaps, without fully realizing it, she had also been opening doors, not just for herself, but for others who would come after her. The thought brought both a sense of purpose and a poignant awareness of how much remained unchanged. For every Magnolia Estates that began to examine its assumptions, How many communities continued to operate with the same implicit biases? For every Sarah Chen or Martha Johnson willing to stand against injustice, how many remained silent, comfortable in the status quo? As these questions turned in her mind, Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text message from Jason Reyes. Just heard the news about the follow-up inspection. Victory! Planning celebration at Martha's after Tuesday's inspection. You're the guest of honor. The message brought a smile to Eleanor's face and a renewed determination to her heart. Whatever Tuesday's inspection revealed, whatever challenges still lay ahead at Magnolia Estates, Eleanor Washington would meet them with the same quiet strength that had guided her life, not just for herself, but for all those watching to see if dignity and justice could prevail. If you're inspired by stories of individuals who stand firm in their principles even when faced with opposition, please hit that like button and subscribe. Your support helps us share more stories of courage and transformation that can change communities. Tuesday dawned clear and slightly cooler, as if the recent storm had washed away some of August's oppressive heat. Eleanor dressed with particular care, choosing a professional outfit that made her feel both confident and comfortable. Today's follow-up inspection at Magnolia Estates represented more than a routine check of safety violations. It had become a symbolic moment for a community in transition. As she gathered her equipment and reviewed her notes from the initial inspection, Eleanor thought about how differently she would be entering Magnolia Estates today. The first time, she had been an unwelcome outsider, her authority questioned before she'd even begun her work. Today, she would arrive as someone with allies in the community, her professional judgment vindicated, her presence anticipated by at least some with respect rather than resistance. The drive to Magnolia Estates felt almost meditative, the familiar route now laden with memories and meaning accumulated over just 2 weeks. As Eleanor approached the ornate gates, she noticed several people gathered near the clubhouse. Martha Johnson's silver head immediately recognizable, along with Sarah Chen's elegant posture and Michael Davis's distinguished presence. To Eleanor's mild surprise, Richard Whitmore stood among them, his expression suggesting reluctant participation rather than genuine engagement. Eleanor parked her car and gathered her inspection materials, taking a deep breath before stepping out into the pleasant morning air, already warming with the promise of another hot day. As she approached the waiting group, Martha stepped forward with a warm smile. "Good morning, Eleanor," she said, extending her hand in greeting. "We wanted to welcome you properly today." Eleanor returned the smile, accepting the handshake with genuine appreciation. "Good morning, Martha. It's good to see you." The other residents offered their own greetings, friendly from Jason, respectful from Sarah and Michael, stiffly formal from Richard. Eleanor acknowledged each one with professional courtesy, including Richard, whose complaint against her had been dismissed but whose opposition clearly remained. "I'll be conducting a thorough follow-up today," Eleanor explained to the group, focusing on the violations identified in the initial inspection and verifying that all required corrections have been properly implemented. "Anyone is welcome to accompany me during the process." "I'll be joining you," Richard stated immediately, his tone making it clear this was supervision rather than support. "As will I," Sarah added, with a pointed look at Richard that suggested she was there to ensure fairness on all sides. The inspection began at the pool area, where the most serious violations had been identified. Eleanor worked methodically, checking the electrical repairs, testing water quality, examining safety equipment, and verifying that warning signs were properly posted. Throughout the process, she explained each step clearly, answering Sarah's thoughtful questions and addressing Richard's occasional challenges with professional detachment. "The electrical issue has been properly addressed," Eleanor noted, examining the certification from the licensed electrician who had performed the work. "And the water quality tests show appropriate chemical balance. That's significant improvement from the initial inspection." As they moved to the pump house to check the filtration system, Eleanor noticed Thomas Gregory hovering nervously nearby. The maintenance supervisor had been conspicuously absent from the welcoming committee, but now he approached, clipboard in hand. "Ms. Washington," he began, his voice carrying a tension that immediately put Eleanor on alert, "I've prepared the maintenance logs you requested." Eleanor accepted the clipboard, reviewing the neatly completed forms with a practiced eye. Unlike the hastily fabricated logs from her first visit, these appeared legitimate, with appropriate variations in measurements and detailed notes about maintenance procedures. "Thank you, Mr. Gregory," she said, continuing to examine the documentation. "I see you've implemented a new testing protocol for chemical balance." Thomas nodded, glancing briefly at Richard before responding. "Yes, ma'am. After your inspection, We realized our procedures weren't as thorough as they should have been." The admission, though carefully worded to avoid acknowledging previous falsification, represented a significant shift from the defensive stance Thomas had taken during earlier interactions. Eleanor noted the change with quiet satisfaction, recognizing it as a small but meaningful step toward accountability. As the inspection continued, Eleanor observed other subtle changes at Magnolia Estates. Residents who encountered the inspection group offered friendly greetings rather than suspicious glances. Several parents with young children stopped to thank Eleanor for ensuring the pool's safety. Even the physical environment seemed different, more open somehow, as if the community had collectively exhaled a breath it had been holding for too long. By early afternoon, Eleanor had completed her comprehensive review. The group reconvened in the clubhouse conference room, where Eleanor prepared to deliver her findings. The space felt charged with anticipation, with Richard sitting rigidly at one end of the table while Martha, Sarah, Michael, and Jason arranged themselves at the other, a physical representation of the community's division. "Based on today's follow-up inspection," Eleanor began, her voice clear and professional, "I can confirm that all critical safety violations identified in the initial inspection have been properly addressed. The electrical hazards have been corrected, safety equipment has been replaced or repaired, and water quality now meets required standards." Richard's posture relaxed slightly, a hint of vindication in his expression. "However," Eleanor continued, "I must note that these corrections, while appropriate, don't address the underlying issues that allowed the violations to develop initially. The maintenance protocols still lack proper oversight, staff training documentation is incomplete, and there isn't a clear system for residents to report safety concerns." Richard's jaw tightened. "The violations have been fixed. That's what matters." "Compliance isn't just about fixing violations after they're identified," Eleanor replied evenly. "It's about creating systems that prevent violations from occurring in the first place. Safety isn't a one-time achievement, it's an ongoing commitment." Sarah Chen nodded, her expression thoughtful. "What would you recommend, Ms. Washington? As a board member, I want to ensure we're taking a comprehensive approach to safety management." The question opened a discussion that lasted nearly an hour, with Eleanor outlining best practices for maintenance oversight, resident communication, and safety protocols. Throughout the conversation, she maintained her focus on professional recommendations rather than personal judgments, on systems rather than individuals. Even when Richard occasionally interjected with defensive comments, Eleanor responded with calm clarity rather than confrontation. As the meeting concluded, Eleanor presented her final report, a thorough document that acknowledged the corrections made while outlining recommendations for ongoing improvements. Richard accepted it with grudging professionalism, his earlier hostility tempered by the undeniable expertise Eleanor had demonstrated throughout the process. "Magnolia Estates is now in compliance with all applicable safety regulations," Eleanor summarized. "The pool facility can continue to operate normally, provided the maintenance protocols we've discussed are implemented and documented appropriately. I'll schedule a routine follow-up in 6 months, as is standard procedure for facilities that have addressed significant violations." With the official business concluded, Eleanor gathered her materials, prepared to leave Magnolia Estates for what might be the last time in her professional capacity. But as she stood to go, Martha stepped forward. "Before you leave, Eleanor, I want to extend a formal invitation. The community is hosting a safety awareness event this Saturday, an educational program for residents about pool safety, emergency procedures, and maintenance awareness. We'd be honored if you could attend as our guest speaker." The invitation represented something profound, a recognition of Eleanor's expertise that transcended the formal inspection process, an acknowledgement that she had something valuable to offer the community beyond regulatory enforcement. It was, in its own way, a form of atonement for the initial dismissal of her authority. "I'd be happy to participate," Eleanor replied, genuine appreciation in her voice. "Thank you for the invitation." As Eleanor walked toward her car, she felt a presence behind her and turned to find Richard Whitmore following at a measured pace. His expression suggested internal conflict, a man struggling with pride and something approaching recognition. "Ms. Washington," he began when he reached her, his voice lacking its usual authoritative edge, "I want to acknowledge that your inspection was thorough and professional. The safety issues you identified were legitimate, and Magnolia Estates is safer now because of your intervention." It wasn't quite an apology, but from Richard Whitmore, it represented a significant concession, Perhaps the closest he could come to admitting his initial reaction had been based on bias rather than facts. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," Eleanor replied simply. "Safety is everyone's responsibility. I'm glad we could work together to ensure the well-being of your community." The exchange was brief but meaningful, a small bridge across a divide that had once seemed impassable. As Eleanor drove away from Magnolia Estates, she felt a sense of completion that went beyond professional accomplishment. What had begun as a routine inspection had become a catalyst for change, not just in pool maintenance procedures, but in attitudes and assumptions that had gone unchallenged for too long. Later that evening, as Eleanor shared the day's events with her daughter Amelia over the phone, she struggled to articulate the significance of what had transpired. "It feels like something important happened," she said, "but I'm not sure I can put it into words exactly." "You made them see you, Mom," Amelia replied simply. "Really see you, not just as a black woman who didn't belong in their space, but as a professional with expertise they needed, as a person deserving of respect. And once they saw you, some of them started to see themselves differently too." The observation cut to the heart of what Eleanor had experienced at Magnolia Estates. Beyond the technical details of pool safety and regulatory compliance, beyond the professional victory of having her findings vindicated, what had unfolded was a human story of recognition, of being seen, heard, and valued for who she truly was. As Tuesday became Wednesday, and the follow-up inspection became part of Eleanor's growing collection of professional memories, she found herself thinking about the ripple effects that might continue long after her formal role at Magnolia Estates had concluded. Perhaps a child who had witnessed the interactions would remember that authority could look like Eleanor Washington. Perhaps a resident who had participated in the community discussions would approach future encounters with different assumptions. Perhaps even Richard Whitmore, in quiet moments of reflection, might begin to question patterns of thought and behavior that had gone unexamined for decades. These possibilities represented the truest measure of what had been accomplished, not just compliance with safety regulations, but small steps toward a world where dignity and justice weren't exceptional achievements but everyday expectations. Life is full of moments that test our resolve and challenge us to stand firm in our values. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where staying true to your principles led to unexpected positive changes? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. Saturday arrived with a gentle breeze that carried the first hint of autumn, a welcome respite from August's relentless heat. Eleanor stood before her bedroom mirror, considering her appearance with unusual attention. The safety awareness event at Magnolia Estates represented something different from her previous visits. Not an inspection where her authority derived from regulations and official position, but a community gathering where she had been invited to share her knowledge as a respected expert. She chose a royal blue dress that her daughter Amelia had given her for her birthday, professional but less formal than her usual inspection attire. Around her neck, she placed the silver pendant that had belonged to her mother, a simple design that represented generations of quiet strength and enduring dignity. "Legacy work," Eleanor murmured to her reflection, her mother's phrase echoing across the years. The drive to Magnolia Estates felt different today. No clipboard of regulations to enforce, no testing equipment to calibrate, no violations to document. Instead, Eleanor had prepared an engaging presentation about pool safety, emergency procedures, and the importance of regular maintenance. She had included activities for children and practical demonstrations for adults, designed to make safety education accessible and meaningful for the entire community. As she approached the now familiar gates of Magnolia Estates, Eleanor was surprised by the transformation that greeted her. The clubhouse area had been decorated with colorful banners announcing the Community Safety Awareness Day. Tables with refreshments had been set up on the lawn, and residents of all ages were already gathering, conversations flowing easily in the pleasant morning air. Martha Johnson spotted Eleanor immediately, waving her over with an enthusiastic gesture. "Eleanor, you're right on time. We've had a wonderful turnout. Nearly half the community is here already, and more are coming." Around them, children darted between clusters of adults, their laughter creating a soundtrack of innocent joy. Eleanor noticed that the gathering was more diverse than she might have expected. Not just the handful of minority families Jason had mentioned, but visitors from neighboring communities as well, creating a mosaic of faces and voices that reflected the broader region. "Martha, this is impressive," Eleanor said, genuine appreciation in her voice. "You've created something important here." "We've created it," Martha corrected gently. "Your inspection was the catalyst, Eleanor. It forced us to look at more than just pool maintenance. It made us examine how we function as a community, who gets heard, Who makes decisions? She gestured toward where Sarah Chen was directing volunteers, her natural leadership evident in her composed efficiency. Sarah's been elected to head the new safety committee. Michael is developing an outreach program to connect Magnolia Estates with surrounding neighborhoods. And Jason, well, Jason has become our conscience, always asking the questions no one else thinks to ask. Before Eleanor could respond, she noticed Richard Whitmore approaching, his expression suggesting internal conflict rather than the dismissive authority he had initially projected. He stopped before them, nodding politely. "Ms. Washington, thank you for coming today." His words were formal but not hostile. "The board has approved a comprehensive safety protocol based on your recommendations. We'll be implementing it immediately." It wasn't quite an olive branch, but it represented a shift, a grudging acknowledgement that Eleanor's expertise had value regardless of his personal feelings about her. She accepted the information with a professional nod. "That's excellent news, Mr. Whitmore. Proactive safety management will serve the community well." Their interaction was interrupted by Jason Reyes, who approached with his 2 children in tow. "Ms. Washington, my kids have been asking when they'd see you again. They think you're some kind of superhero after what happened at the pool." The children, a boy of about 8 and a girl perhaps 6, looked up at Eleanor with undisguised admiration, their expressions bringing an unexpected lump to her throat. In their eyes, she wasn't someone fighting for basic respect and recognition. She was simply powerful, someone who had made their world safer through her authority and knowledge. "Well, I'm definitely not a superhero," Eleanor replied with a warm smile. "Just someone doing her job. But maybe you two can help me with my presentation today? I need some assistance to demonstrate proper safety procedures." Their enthusiastic agreement cemented Eleanor's role transition from inspector to educator, someone sharing knowledge rather than enforcing regulations, building community rather than documenting violations. As the formal program began, Eleanor found herself moving with ease through her presentation, encouraged by the engaged participation and thoughtful questions from residents of all ages. During a demonstration of proper rescue techniques, Eleanor caught sight of Thomas Gregory standing at the back of the gathered crowd, his expression suggesting remorse rather than the defensive posture he had maintained during her inspections. When their eyes met briefly, he offered a small nod, not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement of her legitimate authority that had been absent in their earlier interactions. As the morning progressed into afternoon, the event took on a celebratory atmosphere. Children splashed in the now certified safe pool, families shared picnic lunches on the lawn, and conversations flowed easily between residents who, according to Martha's quiet asides to Eleanor, had barely spoken to each other before the events set in motion by the inspection. "You know what amazes me?" Martha said as they watched the community enjoying the day. "How quickly things can change when people are finally ready for change." Some of these conversations about inclusion and representation should have happened 20 years ago when Magnolia Estates was first built. But it took your inspection, your presence, your dignity in the face of disrespect, to create the opening. Eleanor considered this thoughtfully. Change is rarely about one moment or one person, Martha. It's about timing, readiness, and countless small actions that finally reach a tipping point. "I was just doing my job. With integrity, when it would have been easier not to," Martha added. "That matters, Eleanor. It matters enormously." As the afternoon began to wane, Sarah Chen approached with an official-looking folder. "Ms. Washington, Eleanor, before you leave, I wanted to share something with you." She opened the folder to reveal board minutes and a formal resolution. This was passed unanimously at yesterday's emergency meeting. It's a public apology for the treatment you received during your initial inspection and a commitment to ensuring all visitors to Magnolia Estates are treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their position or background. Eleanor accepted the folder, moved by the gesture despite her professional composure. The resolution represented more than a personal vindication. It was an institutional acknowledgement of the biases that had shaped interactions at Magnolia Estates, a formal commitment to change that would remain in community records long after the individuals involved had moved on. "Thank you, Sarah," she said simply. "This is meaningful." As Eleanor prepared to leave, residents approached to express appreciation, some for her technical expertise, others for her gracious handling of difficult situations, a few simply for being who she was in a space that had not initially welcomed her presence. Each interaction carried its own significance, each represented a small bridge across divides that had once seemed permanent. The last person to approach was a young black woman Eleanor hadn't met before, perhaps in her early 20s, with a quiet dignity that reminded Eleanor of her daughter Amelia. "Ms. Washington," the young woman began, "I'm Zoe Davis, Michael's granddaughter. I just wanted to thank you personally. I'm studying civil engineering, and seeing you stand your ground here, it meant something to me. Made me feel like maybe I won't always have to fight so hard to be taken seriously in my field." The simple statement encapsulated everything Eleanor had hoped her career might mean beyond the technical aspects of her work, that each door she pushed open might stay open a little wider for those who came after her, that each small battle for recognition might make the next one slightly less necessary. "The fight gets easier, Zoe," Eleanor replied, clasping the young woman's hand warmly. "Not because the barriers disappear completely, but because you get stronger, and because others join you in pushing against them. And sometimes, when you least expect it, you find allies in surprising places." As Eleanor finally drove away from Magnolia Estates, she reflected on the journey that had begun with a routine pool inspection and evolved into something that felt almost like community transformation. The changes weren't complete or perfect. Richard Whitmore's reluctant compliance wasn't the same as genuine understanding, and institutional biases wouldn't disappear with one board resolution. But something had shifted, both at Magnolia Estates and within Eleanor herself. She thought about her mother's words about legacy work, about opening doors that others had tried to close. Throughout her career, Eleanor had focused on doing her job with integrity and persistence, on proving through consistent excellence that she deserved the authority she held. But perhaps the most important work had been something less tangible, the steady insistence on being seen as she truly was, the quiet refusal to be diminished or dismissed, the dignity maintained even when others tried to deny it. As she turned onto her own street, Eleanor noticed her neighbors gathered for an impromptu Saturday barbecue. They waved, inviting her to join them. In that simple gesture of community, in the connections that sustained her beyond professional accomplishments, Eleanor found the truest measure of a life well lived. Not just in doors opened or barriers challenged, but in the relationships formed along the way, in the recognition of our shared humanity despite the differences that too often divide us. That evening, as fireflies once again rose from her garden like sparks from a hidden fire, Eleanor called her daughter Amelia to share the day's events. The conversation flowed easily between them, weighted with the significance of what had unfolded at Magnolia Estates but lightened by the shared understanding between mother and daughter. "I'm proud of you, Mom," Amelia said as their call neared its end. "Not just for standing your ground, but for helping them see beyond their assumptions. That's the hardest work there is." "Your grandmother would say it's legacy work," Eleanor replied, the familiar phrase a bridge between generations. "Opening doors that others try to close. And keeping them open," Amelia added. "That's what you've always done, Mom. Kept the doors open for me, for everyone who comes after you." The words settled around Eleanor like a blessing, an affirmation of a life dedicated to quiet persistence in the face of resistance, to maintaining dignity when others would deny it, to creating paths where none had existed before. What had begun as a routine pool inspection had become something far more significant, a reminder that change happens not in dramatic gestures but in the accumulated impact of everyday courage, of simply being who you are with uncompromising integrity, even when others expect you to be less. As summer gave way to autumn, as leaves began to turn gold and crimson against a deepening blue sky, Eleanor Washington continued her work, inspecting facilities, enforcing regulations, ensuring public safety. But she carried with her the lessons of Magnolia Estates, the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful act is simply refusing to be less than who you are, that dignity maintained in the face of dismissal can become a catalyst for transformation that ripples far beyond one person or one moment. And in communities across the city, in pools and restaurants and public buildings made safer through her diligent oversight, in the lives touched by her unwavering integrity, Eleanor's legacy took root. Not in monuments or accolades, but in the subtle shift toward a world where doors stand open for all who wish to pass through them, where authority is respected regardless of the package it comes in, where dignity is not something to be earned but a birthright universally acknowledged. If this story of quiet courage and transformation has touched you, please take a moment to subscribe and share it with others who might find inspiration in Eleanor's journey. And if you're watching the video that appears on your screen right now, I promise it contains an even more powerful story of triumph over adversity that will leave you both moved and inspired.